Tailwind CSS is one of my favorite front-end technologies to use right now because it gives you the ability to make your apps look really good really quickly. In this video, I'll be showing you how to use Tailwind to style a plain text React website to look like this AirBNB landing page. Let's get started. So here I have an empty React project that I created with Create React App, and it's in TypeScript. And I've just cleared out all the content from the div. So I have basically an empty div here as my project and deleted all the images as well. And this is where we're going to be starting from. So to get started, I think a good way to learn is for us to have an example web page or landing page that we want to use as our objective. And then we'll see if we can recreate that using Tailwind. I think that this is a good way to learn, especially if you're just starting out. And for this, I've picked Airbnb's landing page for Airbnb host, which I think is quite a simple landing page, and I think it's got a couple of interesting elements. So for our project, we're just gonna see if we can create this view here. And I'm not gonna go all the way and create all the rest of this page, but just this top two sections that we see here. To start this, let's first just create a bunch of divs with all of these text elements and then fill them out with the content here. So what I've done here is just gone ahead and create divs for each of these text elements and just copied over the text of these first two parts. Let's take a break and see how that actually looks in our app right now. So you can see it's just plain boring text. There's really nothing going on at the moment. Before we go on and install Tailwind, let's actually add some appropriate headers to this so we at least get some structure. And by that, I just mean changing some of these tags to match the type of the content. So we'll turn some of these elements into headers and some of them into buttons or interactive elements. This first element here, I think it's probably a header 2 because this is smaller, and this is probably the main header, header 1. These can be paragraphs. This is going to be a button. This might be another header 2, and then these will each be header 3s. So let's go ahead and do that. Just by changing the tags, the layout has already updated a little bit. It looks better. Some text is bigger. There's a button here I can click, and there's a little bit more structure to it, but it still looks pretty bad if we compare it to our example. The content of the site, however, is exactly the same. So we have all the text here and the button here as well. The next step is to actually make this start to look good. So we first have to install Tailwind. This is the point where we'll go to the Tailwind website. If you type in the quick search box or you press Ctrl-K, then the search button will come up. And there'll be a page on how you can install Tailwind with React websites. So this installation documentation here, install Tailwind CSS with Create React App. Click on that and follow the instructions to set up Tailwind in your project. The first step is to create the app, but we've already done that. So we're just going to go to the next step, which is install Tailwind CSS. I'm just going to copy this chunk of code over here and run that in my terminal. Once it's finished installing, we also have to configure the template paths. It says here, add this line to the template file tailwind.config.js. That's because the way Tailwind works is that it needs to compile the CSS every time we make a change in the code. And this config tells us where the content of our site is, so that if any of these files changes, then Tailwind will be forced to recompile the CSS. So let's just copy this chunk here and update our tailwind config.js. And I'm just going to replace this line with the content here so that it knows to update these files. The next step is to add these Tailwind directives to the CSS. And that's this file over here. And I'm just going to go ahead and replace all of this. I don't need the existing CSS anymore, and I'll replace it with the Tailwind components. So now I've copied that, and the next one is to start the build process. So even though I've already started it, I probably will just run it again just to make sure that it's installed properly and started up properly. So let's just rerun it right there. And now my web server is up again and all my styling is gone, so it's just back to basics. But that's good because that means that Tailwind is probably working and installed correctly. And in the last step of the installation, number 6, it says start using Tailwind in your project. So we can start adding these utility classes to style the content. And in the example, it adds this class name, text 3XL font bold underline to the header 1. So let's just go ahead and copy that and add it to our header 1 and see if anything changes. And you can see that the styling has updated just from us using these specific class names. So now we know that Tailwind's ready and we can actually start styling our project the way we want to. Just in case you're new to Tailwind or styling projects in general, then you might be wondering what it actually is or what it does and how it's different from regular CSS. Tailwind describes itself as a utility-first CSS framework. The short of it is that instead of styling our project by writing CSS, we use these classes that Tailwind create instead directly into our div, and that will, by combining them, for example, text size, color, padding, margins, we can style the project directly without having to leave our JSX. And for what it's worth, Tailwind is also compatible with things like Django, Vue, or basically any other front-end framework. I'm just using React now because it is the most popular framework, but you can use Tailwind anywhere you'd normally be able to use CSS to style your project. So now that Tailwind is set up properly in our project and we know what it is, let's use it to make our site look something like this. So this will be at the top. It will be bold-ish and capitalized. And then this part will be really big, and then here it will just be a normal text. And then we'll have a button here as well. And if you don't have any idea how to do that, then the way I like working with Tailwind is just having the documentation open here on the side tab, and then pressing Ctrl-K to search for the things that I want to do. So for example, I wanted to change the font size, and then a couple of things will pop up, so we can click this page here, and then we'll see a couple of examples. So these are the classes we can use to manipulate the font size. And this is the CSS that it will translate to. And we said that we want to make this text bigger and maybe bolder as well. So let's try that. I've got this text extra large here. So let's see what that looks like. And then for this one, we already have 3XL from our example, but I think that's a bit small, so let's make it even bigger. Make it 5XL. I think we'll take the underline out because we don't need that. And then this part, it's quite small compared to the rest of it, but it looks bigger in here than it does in my app, so I'm gonna change that as well, and I'm gonna make it just large, which is LG. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Now, another thing to notice is that this text seems to wrap around, it's quite short, like it doesn't extend all the way out to the sides of my page. And there's a good reason for that, is because if we're reading things on a screen, we don't want to move our eyes like really far horizontally across the screen. So it's actually easier to read things that are in a confined space. So now we're gonna have to put this inside a div and make that div have a limited size. Even though the background div is still big and stretches all the way across the screen, the actual text part of it has to have a limited size. So let's see if we can do that here. So first of all, I'm gonna create a div to wrap these text elements. Gonna put it into there like this. So now this is inside a div, but it's kind of hard to see because divs are invisible, so you can't see them unless you right-click, inspect, and then look at all the things that the browser tell you. But a trick I like to use is just to add a colored border around the div while I'm working on it so I can see where it is. So let's see how we can do that with Tailwind. Here's a couple of examples for border classes. So here we have border 2, border rows 500. So I guess this is the color. So let me try this. With my div, I'm gonna type border 2. I guess that's 2 pixels, and then border red. Nice bright red color. And there's different types of red, how light or how dark they are. So I'm gonna pick a middle one, which is red 500. By the way, if you want to have this pop-up plugin that shows you what type of Tailwind classes are available, then this is an extension you can install in Visual Studio Code. If you search the extension marketplace, you'll find one called Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. So go ahead and install that, and it will pop up autocomplete for you if you're working with Tailwind classes. It's extremely useful. It saves you from having to memorize all of the class names and all of the format of these classes. So once you use it for a while, then this will really come in handy. Okay, so now I've added the border to this div. And remember, what I wanted to do is make it shorter here. So all the way up to here. So how can we do that? I'm thinking we can put a max size constraint on it, so it can't go further than a certain size. So let's see if this shows up somewhere. Max width, here we go. So if I type in max width, then there's a help page here with a couple of options, including small, medium, large. Let's put it at medium and see how that looks. Max WMD. Okay, I think that looks a lot better. Maybe we can make it larger. This looks a bit larger than what I have. Maybe even XL. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that, so I'm gonna keep it at that for now. And the next element is this button here, this try hosting button. So this is a bit more complex because now we have this element that we can click. And I don't know if you can see from the recording, but there's a very slight gradient that moves with the mouse. That's a bit complex for us, so we're not going to try that, but we will try to add just a static gradient there. And we also have these rounded corners and this extra padding. So yeah, again, this element is a little bit more complex. Let's just get started with the biggest thing first, which is this red background. So here we need to learn how to add background color to an element. And if I just type control here, do background color, then there are some examples here. So yeah, it's just BG and then dash and then the color we want. So there's a lot of different colors. And we'll probably pick some kind of reddish color for that. So let's go ahead and add our background color here. See how that looks. Okay, so now my button is red and it's got quite a bit of space between the text and the border. So we can probably do this with padding. So padding is the space between the div and the elements inside it. And padding in Tailwind, if I type in padding here, it's a very simple class. It's just P and then the number. The number doesn't necessarily translate to a pixel number. So the way the numbers work in Tailwind is that they're just ordinal. So 0 is smaller, well, 0 is always 0, and then you have 1, and then 2 is always bigger than 1, but not necessarily double the size or not necessarily 2 pixels. For example, if I type P2 here, you're going to see that P2 is actually 8 pixels. So these numbers are kind of designed by Tailwind so that you can just decide on a rough number on what you want without having to know the exact pixel value, and somehow it's all going to scale and fit really well. So let's just try this with P2 and see how that looks. Okay, so this is quite a bit better. However, with buttons like these, I actually noticed that the padding on the side, so on the x-axis, is usually a bit more than on the vertical axis. So to do that with Tailwind, you actually see that there's px and py as well. And that gives us a little bit more control because this will do padding of 2 on all sides. But if I want to have padding of 2 just for the y-axis, I can do py2. So now I've got that padding of 2 here, and now I can have a bigger padding for the x-axis, so maybe something like px4. Okay, so I think this button looks a little bit better now. I'll maybe increase these numbers because I do think that the version does look a little bit bigger than mine here. Okay, so that's a little bit bigger, and the text is probably also a little bit bigger, so that may be a text large. Okay, how do we do the rounded corners though? Let's go ahead and search for that. Rounded corners, so border radius, and the class name is literally just rounded, rounded medium, large, or full. So we can see the examples here. So I think I'm going to go with a rounded medium. Let's just copy that and put it in. Okay, so I've got slightly rounded corners. Might be hard to tell right now, but I've got slightly rounded corners on the edges there now. So I think that's probably fine for the moment. So now that the headings and the text and the button in this top section are in a better shape, let's focus on the layout a little bit. Let's get this sort of centered in the page get a dark background. We're going to put an image there later, but first let's start with the dark background so then we can make the text this white color. And then let's get the spacing between each of these elements right, including this big spacing here between the section and this padding here along the sides. To adjust the layout of this element, I'm going to create another div that I'm going to put it into. And now I'm going to make this outer div have a dark background. So we remember that the background was BG and then the color. Let's pick a dark color. So BG slate looks pretty good. Let's pick slate 700, see what that looks like. Let's make these text elements white. With Tailwind, just like regular CSS, if we put a style inside a div, then all the children of that div will inherit that style. So if I just put text white, even though this element itself doesn't have text directly, all the children element will have white text now. And now I want to have a bit of padding, because you see here, this is nicely padded from the top and from the sides, but ours is kind of stuck to the corner. So let's add a bit of padding here. We'll make px maybe something like 6. There's a bit of space, maybe 8, just more space. And then the vertical padding looks a bit bigger, so we're just going to double that and then do py16. Okay, so I think that looks a little bit better. And now we want gaps between each of these elements as well. One thing I could do is I could add margins to each of these things. So a margin is like padding, except it works outside the element. So this element here, this become a host. If I add a margin to this, say I add margin bottom, MB stands for margin bottom. If I do margin bottom 8 like this, it'll give me a bit of space between this and this one. And that's what I want. I can copy that to each of them. But if I have a bunch of elements in a row like this inside a div, and I pretty much want the same spacing between them, and I want to, only edit that once, then what I could actually do is create a grid out of this div, and then just set the gap size. So I don't have to keep repeating this MB8 class. And this is actually useful when you have something that you're automating, for example, like messages or items in a shop that you don't have, you don't want to add these classes to every single one of them, and you just want a predefined gap between each of them. So let's look at what the grid class does in Tailwind. So we have grid template columns, and we can create it by using grid columns 1 or 2, how many columns we want. So in this case, it's just all straight down, so it's just going to be one column. And I can do it like this. So grid column 1, and yeah, let's try that. Copy that element there and see if we can get some kind of gap for each of our elements here. So I'm going to take this margin 1 back out, and now I'm going to create a grid. I can actually make this border thing I have right now the actual grid, so I don't have to create a new div. So I do this. Nothing's changed apart from my button, which is sort of just stretched out to fill the entire width. I think that's just a HTML thing or a styling thing, but we can fix that by just typing width and then just choosing a number so that the size of this button is fixed. Okay, I think that looks fine. And now that all of this stuff is in a grid, we can actually use a class called gap. And again, there's a number system here, so we can pick a gap size, and this will create a gap between all our elements in the grid. So let's do gap 8, see if that looks good. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. And another little detail as well is that this become a host is fully uppercase. I can do that by just typing this in uppercase, but if you just want this to be a style and you don't know what text is going to go here, then it might be better to make that as part of the class instead. And Tailwind actually has an uppercase class. So if you just type in uppercase, there's a text transform, and then there's normal case, uppercase, lowercase, capitalize. We'll just take the uppercase one here, and then put it into this header. And now our header has become an uppercase. I think the text also looks a little bit bolder than normal, so it's not, this looks a bit thin. So if we go to the Tailwind documentation again and look for bold, then it's under this font weight class, and we have font bold and a bunch of other ones as well, but we'll be using font bold to change its weight. So let's do that. Maybe I'll just go ahead and make that header one a little bit bigger. Let's take out that border on this thing as well, and then we can start working on the bottom part. Okay, so now the top part looks pretty good. We're gonna come back to this and change a couple more things, but for now, let's just go to the bottom part and get that looking somewhat reasonable as well. So the first thing you'll notice about the bottom is that there seems to be this 2 columns here. And again, we've already done this grid column system, so we can try to use that again with 2 columns and see if we can apply that here. But we also have this large chunk of a header here as well that, again, like this one, the text is only limited to a certain size. So we might have to do the same trick, create a div that has a limited size and just put it here again. But let's give that a go. So first of all, let's create a whole div to wrap up this entire bottom element because we're gonna want padding between the edges of the screen. Let's just put all this stuff in there. Okay, so nothing's changed, that's fine. And now for the class name, I'm gonna create padding. I'm gonna use the same padding I used up here, which is px8 and py16, just to make it look a bit consistent. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And this part is quite a big header, this header 2 here. Let's make that really big first. Text 4XL. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. But now we want to make it just half the size of this as well. So this is gonna be another div that I'm gonna wrap it in. I'm gonna put my header 2 into that div. And now let's give this one a max size. Okay, I think it can be a little bit bigger. And I think my text can also be a little bit bigger. Okay, that looks fine for me. And now I'll probably want a gap between this and the next bit as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead and put a margin there. So now the next step is I want to make 2 columns, have these become headers, and then have this slightly, it looks like slightly lighter gray than black. So it'll be a dark grayish color with these text, and there'll just be 2 little sub elements. Let's go ahead and make a grid to hold this stuff. And for this one, I'm actually gonna bring back the border so we can see it more clearly. So border, and then it's gonna be a border red 500. So I've got my element there. It's just an empty div right now. And I'll put this 2 elements into there. See how we go. Okay, so now they're in here. So these are right now sort of flattened out in the same element. Let's wrap this one and this one each into their own elements. So I'm gonna make a div for each of them and put them in. Okay, and now I'm gonna create a grid column for these 2. Actually, before I do that, I'm gonna make these sub elements have borders as well so we can actually see what's happening to them. Okay, so we can see the 2 borders between these now. Now let's turn this top one into a grid. And if you remember how we did that before, or just looking at Tailwind, type in control and then grid columns. We want 2 columns this time. So grid columns 2. We also need the grid class to tell Tailwind that it is a grid. So we want grid with grid columns 2. Okay, now one's on the left and one's on the right. Let's put a little bit of a gap between them. So maybe a gap of just 4 units, 4 Tailwind units, whatever that is. And now we can style these elements. I might just style one of them and then copy the style over to the other. So first of all, we want this header to be a little bit bigger. Let's make it text 2XL. It looks a little bit bolder as well, so why don't we do that? Okay. Usually with header, it's good to have a bit of space between this and the text element that follows, so I like to put quite a small margin as well. I'm not sure if they did that here, but I think that looks a bit better than if it was cramped up. Yeah, I think they did the same here because there's quite a bit of a gap between the header and the paragraph. And this is just one of the things why I like, if you're learning, to just copy existing designs or good designs, because you pick up on little things like this that you might not figure it out on your own or have the idea to do on your own until you see and realize that, hey, that's something that people do and there's a reason for it. And this one, I don't think we have to change this much. I just think that it's slightly bigger than the normal size, so maybe a text large, at least at the screen size. I think that looks fine. And I think in their example, all of these elements, these text is not exactly a black color. It looks like a slightly dark gray to me. That's pretty good because it creates a kind of depth to the text. So not everything looks all the same. So let's go ahead and put a color on top of all of these. And I'm gonna do that actually at this very top element here where I have the grid and the border, just because I think I want the color to apply to all of them. So we'll do a text slate, maybe 600. Okay, I think that looks a little bit better. It's a slightly softer color than pure black, but you can still read it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and copy the style down to the other class here, so we have them. Okay, and then just go ahead and remove the border. So I noticed they actually do have quite a bit of a bigger space between this element here and ours, so I'll just go ahead and do that as well, because I do think that looks better. Okay, so just comparing them side by side, I think that doesn't look too bad. Let's keep on looking at ways to improve this. So first of all, the big one is this background image. There's a couple of things to notice about this as well, is that this background image seems to have this dark edge over here where it's black and then it just kind of fades. I don't think that's part of the image. I think that's a background layer on top of the image just to make the text stand out a little bit more here. So we can try to do that as well. But first, let's just put a background image instead of this plain background that we have. So if I'm mocking up a website, what I like to usually do is just go to unsplash.com, which you can find free images for. And I'll just search for something like mountains or whatever I want to use as a background. Here's a free image to use. I just went and found an awesome mountain image that I've downloaded here, and I've pulled that into my project. So let's go ahead and add that. Now, adding an image to a background like this is actually not a Tailwind thing. I think Tailwind deals with CSS and CSS styles, but when we add an image, we actually need to reference a file from the folder directory. For this, I'm going to do it just using regular CSS, which I searched on Google how to add background image, and there's this code snippet here, so that's what we're going to do. So I've renamed the image mountains.jpg, and I've dragged it into my source directory in my project here. To use this with React, I have to import it first, so I can import it at the top of my, my file here. I'll say import mountain image from, then it's just going to be mountains.jpg. This is a CSS style, so to inline this into my app, I actually have to create an object to hold this style. So I'll call something like this, background image style. It's going to be an object. Let me just close this folder, I don't need it anymore. And then I'll have this background image URL, but in TypeScript, we don't have dashes, we just use camel case instead. And this has to be a string, so I'm going to turn this into string with backticks because we want to preserve the double quotes. But this part here, I'm going to actually make it mountain image that we imported earlier. Okay, so now I have a style object with the background image property being set to this URL string, and I've replaced the URL with this import that React is going to resolve for me. So this is going to turn into the URL that I need for this image to appear. And then to use this style, I go to the div that I want. So I want this div here with the slate background. So this div, and I'm going to create, or I'm going to tag its style property with that new background style I created. So you just saw that change. It's the background image. You can't see it yet because it's zoomed in all the way like this. So we're going to have to adjust that next by using a couple of other properties. So here I want the background size to be cover. Let's set that and see how it looks. Okay, I think that looks great. So now we actually have our background image and it looks well sized for this space. And as I mentioned before, there's also this dark gradient here on this left side, which I think looks really good, because if you look at our image, some of this text is hard to read because it's just contrasting against really light parts of the image. But this side, we don't really have any text, so it makes sense to have this go from dark to light. So how do we do that? So we go to Tailwind and look for gradient color stops. Then there's a couple of examples here. If we just look at an example like this, so this means a background gradient to the right, so left to right, from the cyan color to this blue color. But we want something that's from a black color to a transparent color. Well, we can do that, but first let's figure out how to get a div in position so that we can actually use this gradient. So here, I think that because the image style takes precedence over the background style, we can't really use the same element, because you can see this slate color is completely overwritten by the background image. So I'm just gonna remove that property now. And I reckon what I'm gonna do is create a class inside this div and then have that be the gradient background. So now I'm going to copy this gradient snippet I have from Tailwind and just put it in there. And this gradient works. But our padding is now in the wrong position. It's padding the gradient as well. So that's an easy fix. I'm just going to move these padding elements from this top div down to this div where I actually have the gradient. Like this. Okay, so now I have the gradient in the same position. I just need to adjust the color. So the from color is pretty easy. It's from black. And if we look at the gradient page here, there's actually from transparent. So I'm guessing there's also a to transparent. But there's quite a lot of them. Let's have a look. To transparent. Oh, well, actually here there's a little section that actually is dedicated to fading towards transparent. Says gradients fade out to transparent by default without requiring you to add a to transparent explicitly. So we don't need to add this. If we want to fade to transparent, all we have to do is just write this and then write the from color. So basically, if we just delete the destination color, this should just work. And there we go. We have this black gradient now fading to this nice color. And I'm pretty happy with the way this looks as an image. Now that we know how to use gradients, let's go ahead and apply this to the button as well, because if you remember, the button here on this AirBNB website actually has a very subtle gradient. So let's go ahead and add this to our button, which is kind of boring, plain red right now. So I've added BG gradient to right, and then I'll need a from color. And there's a lot of colors in Tailwind. Actually, if you type in Tailwind and then do color palette, and you see the default color palette, you'll see how many different colors they have. So we'll pick two reddish colors, maybe this this pink color, and maybe this orange color, and then have them fade between the two. Okay, so now this button looks a little bit more interesting. It's fading from sort of like a pinkish red to a orangey red color. Now, a lot of the times when you're designing a site, you probably want to customize your font as well to pick font that looks right for the design. This one is currently using the default Ubuntu font, which I personally really like it, but if we compare it to the AirBNB, you can see that it's slightly different. This one's just a little bit sharper, a little bit more clean. So if I want to create this look, then I will need to apply a different font. So how do we do that with Tailwind? Let's go back to the documentation and type in custom font. So here we go, using custom font family values. And we'll have to change our export file in the Tailwind config. We've changed this before when we set up the project. We'll have to add this font family property to it, and then we can choose what font we want for what the default one is sans. So we'll just have to replace that with a value that we want. But first, let's go ahead and pick our font from somewhere. I like to use Google Fonts for this. If you just type in Google Fonts, Google has a lot of free fonts that we can use in their Google Fonts website. Just search for one that you want here. Personally, I like this one. I think this will fit the style. So this one is called Poppins. So if you click on it, it'll take you to a page where you can press the button to select the style. This will add it to a palette that this Google site will give you a snippet to download and use in your project. So I've added the regular 400 and the bold 700 to my cart. And then if you go all the way to the top and view selected families, there'll be a pop-up here and there's a link that I can use. This will embed it in my website. So if I copy this link, just this whole section here, I can go back to my React project, go to the index.html, and then just paste the link here. So when my React website loads for a user, it will download these fonts from Google and they should be ready to use. So the font family is called Poppins, and we're going to remember that because now we're going to update our Tailwind template config to use that font. So we go to Tailwind config CSS, and this is all empty. We have to add it like this. So theme, extend, font family, sans, and then this. I'm just going to copy this whole section here and put this into the extend part. Except instead of Proxima Nova, and in fact all of these, I'm going to delete them and put Poppins because that's the one we downloaded. And after I did that, my site kind of blew up. I think it just got stuck when I was halfway through editing this. So let me just quit this and recompile it. Now I've booted it up again, and you can see that the font has changed. So it's this nice, sharper looking font now. So that's pretty much it for adding font, and that's how you can do it. And then the last thing I want to show you how to do is to add icons and logos like this here. Important thing to know about icons is, like, unlike images, these things probably need to be sharp and scale really well. So I don't like using JPEGs or PNGs for things like this. Instead, you want to use a vector graphic format, something like an SVG, and that will make it look good and sharp at any size, which is what you want. One place to get really nice icons from that I've been using is Font Awesome. So you just type in fontawesome.com. You can go and browse a bunch of different icons, including brand icons that you can download as SVGs if you have an account. So I'm going to go and search here for the AirBNB icon. And once I search that, you can see that it shows up here. And if you just click on that, you can see the icon, the SVG here, and how you can use it. You can even just download it as an SVG file. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, download it as an SVG file. And once it's downloaded, I've gone ahead and dragged that into my project source directory as airbnb-brands.svg. So my file is here now. So how can I actually use this? Let's go back to my app.tsx. And just like the image, mountain image we had earlier, we'll probably have to import this one as well. I would say logo, import logo from Airbnb brand. So now if I've imported this logo, I should be able to use it. I can use it in an image element in HTML. For example, if I just create a new element up above here, above become a host thing, like this, like an image element, I can just put the source of this image element to be my logo object. And that will work, but there's a couple of problems. First of all, it's really big and it's a black color. The SVG is basically a vector, so we can change its color pretty easily, even though the original one here is black or dark. However, we can't do that if we do it as an image tag. So we need another way to use this image without using this image tag. Luckily for us, React makes this really easy. We can actually import this as a React component and just use it directly as an element. So I searched this up online and then I found this code snippet. It says import React component as React logo from logo.svg. So let's go ahead and copy this snippet, but adapt it for our code. So I'm just going to copy this first part here, then put it here instead. And now instead of using this image source, I'm just going to create a React logo element like that, and that should work. So let's go ahead and save that and see what happens now. So nothing's changed, it's still there, but now I think that we can actually change the class to change the color of the SVG file itself. Here it turns out that we can control the SVG color by a class called fill, and then we can choose the color, all the colors that Tailwind has to offer. So fill white. and that changes the SVG color to white. It's still really big though, so let's put a div around this and make it have a limited size. So let's make its width maybe something like 12 and put the SVG inside that div. And now that looks a lot better because our element is more appropriate size for this site. So I think that's as far as we'll go for this project today. We've already covered quite a lot of ground going from a plain text website to something that looks a lot better. We've only scratched the surface of what you can actually do with Tailwind and how nice you can make your sites look. But for the time being, I hope that this project was sufficient to demonstrate, the powerful capabilities of this framework and how fast you can make your content look really good. If you want the source code for this project, then check out the comments in the video. Aside from that, have a great day and thank you very much for watching.